I want to tell you a story. This is a true story, one that I have held in my heart for most of my life. It is a heavy thing, like a stone pressing on my heart, a story of trust broken and innocence lost. Perhaps you will find it sad, but I tell it now not to dwell on my own fate, but with the fragile hope that my words might travel, reaching someone who feels alone in their own darkness, and let them know they are not the only one. Your presence here, right now, patiently listening to an old woman about to tell an old tale, means more than you know. It helps me feel the burden on my shoulders lighten just a little. So, if you're willing, could you spare me a moment of your time? My story begins in a very simple place. I was born in a simple place, deep in rural Appalachian Tennessee, in a house with worn-out wooden floorboards that my mother always kept spotless, tidied with care. My father worked on a small tobacco farm all day, coming home late and tired, and my mother did quilting to help out. Money was tight, but there was more than enough love and faith to go around in our house. The small Baptist church was everything to us. Every Sunday, bright and early, my mother would wake me up to go to the service. She'd say we had to thank God for everything we had, even if it was just a plate of beans and cornbread and a roof over our heads. I went happily. I loved the sound of the hymns we sang, the smell of the flowers we brought to decorate the altar, and the sight of people hugging and smiling at each other. It was simple, but special. The church was a wooden building with old pews, but to a child like me, it looked like a castle. There was a pulpit in the middle where the pastor preached, and I would just stare, thinking he was really talking to God. Pastor Miller was the head of the church, a calm man with a strong voice and a gentle way about him. He had graying hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and a way of speaking that made everyone fall silent to listen. Everybody liked him. My mother would tell her friends he was a gift from God to our community. She was always saying he was a holy man who brought God's word to us. At 11 years old, I believed every single thing he preached from that pulpit, thinking he was an angel sent from heaven. At the end of the service, he always greeted everyone at the door, shaking hands and smiling. My mother said he was an example to follow, and I, full of admiration, agreed. My life was like that, a rush between school, playing with my friends in the town park, and church services. At school, I loved Mrs. Gable's classes. She said I was smart and read well. After school, I'd play tag and hide and seek with Cassie, my best friend. We'd run until we were exhausted, laughing loudly and forgetting about the hard parts of life. Sometimes, I'd go into our backyard to pick wild blackberries that grew on the fence line, eating them until my face was stained, and I was happy with those simple things. But the Sunday service was the best day of the week for me. I'd put on my prettiest dress, the one my mother had sewn with so much care, and I'd walk hand in hand with her, singing hymns along the way. My mother was always teaching me to respect my elders and to help at the church because she said it was good for the soul. One day, she told me I could start helping more, arranging the chairs, bringing flowers for the altar, things like that. I was so excited, thinking it was beautiful to be close to God and to help the church my family loved so much. I would bring a handful of flowers I'd picked from the fields, daisies and Queen Anne's lace, and arrange them in an old vase they had there. It looked pretty, and I felt important, as if God himself were truly watching me. One Sunday, while I was arranging the flowers, Pastor Miller walked by and stopped. He had his Bible in his hand, as always, and he looked at me with that smile of his. He spoke in a soft voice. "Oh, Willow, you take such care. God sees everything, and he will bless you greatly." I smiled, full of pride, feeling my face flush with happiness. I was so giddy, thinking I had done something very special. When I got home, I told my mom, and she was thrilled. She said I was on the right path, that helping at the church was a credit to our family. My dad, who was sitting on the porch, heard and said I was an obedient girl and that God would always protect me. I kept going to the services every week, and sometimes even during the week when there was a prayer meeting. My mother liked it when I went. She said it was good for my soul, and I went happily, singing the hymns I knew by heart. Pastor Miller always greeted me, asked how I was doing in school, if I was obeying my parents. I'd answer enthusiastically, telling him I was doing well in my classes and helping my mother at home. He would smile and say I was a child of God, that I had a beautiful future ahead of me. I believed him, never imagining that everything would turn so ugly. Back then, I didn't know what it meant to distrust people. In our small town, everyone knew each other, and we trusted those who were close. The pastor was like a father to the community, someone we looked up to with respect and admiration. My mother said he was a man of God, and I thought that meant he would never do anything wrong. I was just an 11-year-old girl, full of dreams and faith, unaware that the world could be darker than I imagined. But I would only find that out later, and this story will show you how everything in my life changed. My story is just starting to get heavy, but I promise to tell you everything because maybe it will help someone out there. After Pastor Miller praised me for the flowers, my life at the church began to shift. He started to call on me more often, asking for my help not just during the bustling Sunday services, but on quiet weekdays. The church on those days was a vast, silent space, filled with an echoing stillness that felt different, heavier. My mother saw it as a blessing. Willow is being guided by a man of God, she'd boast to the neighbors. My father, weary from the farm, would hear this and nod, pleased I was on the right path. Their approval filled me with a deep, satisfying pride, a sense that I was contributing something meaningful to my family and to God. Pastor Miller had a voice like slow honey, a tone that settled over you and calmed your worries. He would approach me, his Bible a constant presence in his hand, and his calm eyes would hold a smile that seemed meant only for me. You are a true child of God, Willow, he'd say. He has given you such a pure heart. I soaked in his words, my face flushing with joy. He began asking me to stay after services, inquiring about my schoolwork and my life at home. I shared everything with an open heart, believing he was a kind man who genuinely cared. It was only much later that I understood he wasn't just caring, he was studying me, learning my vulnerabilities, mapping the territory of my trust. One afternoon, my mother sent me to take a sweet cornbread loaf she'd baked as a gift for the pastor. I ran over with the loaf wrapped in a cloth and knocked on the door of the small room at the back of the church. He opened the door, all smiles, and said the church was a happier place when I was around. He said he enjoyed my company very much, that I was a blessing. At that moment, my heart swelled with pride, and I thanked him shyly. He invited me in, sat in his chair, and started talking to me, asking about school, my parents, the games I played. I answered everything, thinking it was a nice moment, as if he were a caring uncle. But today I see that his manner was a mask, a way to gain my trust while he prepared to violate it. Yet, there were moments when a strange coil of unease would tighten in my chest. I couldn't put a name to it then, but my body was trying to warn me of danger my mind couldn't yet recognize. One afternoon, while arranging hymnals, I felt his eyes on me from across the sanctuary. He approached silently, then said, "You're becoming a pretty young lady, Willow. The boys will start noticing you soon." A sudden heat rushed to my face. I looked down, my fingers fumbling with the worn book covers. He chuckled, a soft, low sound. "It's good that you're shy. God appreciates modesty in a young woman." When I mentioned it to my mother, she simply laughed. "Oh, he's just teasing you, sweetie. You're still a child." Her words were meant to soothe, but his comment felt like a secret I didn't understand, a door being slowly opened to something I wasn't ready to see. Pastor Miller started giving me more important tasks. He asked me to stand near the altar while he preached, to bring him the Bible at the pulpit, to help set up for the prayer meetings. I did everything with great care, thinking I was pleasing God. My mother was overjoyed. She told her friends the pastor called me his little helper. My father would hear and say I was being a blessing to the church. I felt important, like I was the pastor's special assistant, and that filled me with pride. But now I see he was pulling me closer to him, making me comfortable in his presence so he could do what he wanted when the time was right. The feeling returned one day, stronger this time. As I was wiping down the pews, his footsteps were unnervingly quiet as he came up behind me. His hand rested on my shoulder, its weight sudden and unfamiliar. "You're different from the other children, Willow," he said, his voice close enough that I could feel his breath. "God has chosen you for something great." A cold stone settled in my gut, a definite sense that something was off. He squeezed my shoulder gently, his gaze lingering on me in a way that made my skin prickle. After a long moment, he let go. "Continue your work. God is watching." I fled the church as soon as I could, my heart thudding against my ribs for reasons I couldn't yet piece together. When I got home, my mother asked how my day had been. I told her the pastor said I was chosen by God, and she got all excited, saying it was a blessing. But I didn't tell her about the knot in my stomach because I thought it was just me being silly. My mother always said I had to trust the pastor, that he was a man of God, so I kept that feeling to myself. At night, I lay in bed thinking about what he had said. I tried to pray, asking God to show me if everything was okay, but I fell asleep before I got an answer. Looking back now, I see that moment was the start of a dark path I didn't know I was walking, a path that would lead me away from the innocence I treasured so deeply. Outside the church, my life went on as before. I went to school with Cassie, played in the park in the afternoons, helped my mother with the laundry and sewing. But the church was becoming a bigger part of my day, and Pastor Miller was always around, calling me, praising me, looking at me in a way I couldn't explain. I kept going, happy to help, but that feeling of dread in my stomach was getting stronger, like a cloud I couldn't see but felt approaching. Today I know it wasn't just in my head, and what came next only proves it. Time went on, and Pastor Miller became more and more present in my life. I kept going to church almost every day, arranging the flowers, cleaning the pews, helping with the hymnals. My mother was so proud, and I thought I was pleasing God with my efforts. But that pit in my stomach that I sometimes felt was getting stronger, and today I know it was my heart trying to warn me of what I still couldn't see. One afternoon after school, my mother asked me to take an embroidered altar cloth she had made for the pastor to use. I went with the cloth wrapped up, knocking on the door of the little room at the back of the church. He opened the door with his usual smile and told me I was becoming a very beautiful young lady. He said my hair was shining and that I looked like a flower. I smiled shyly, my face flushing, and thanked him. But something in his voice made me uneasy. It was different from the way he spoke to other children, more intimate, more possessive. He took the cloth, thanked me, and told me to come in for a minute, that he wanted to talk to me. I went in but stayed near the door, a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain. He sat in his chair and started saying that I was very special, that God had chosen me to be an example for the other children. He said I had to trust him because he knew what was best for me. I nodded my head, thinking it was just more advice. But today I see that he was trapping me with those words, making me believe that everything he did was God's will. Before I left, he ran his hand through my hair slowly and said I was growing up fast, that soon I'd be a real young woman. I left there with my heart pounding, feeling a chill I didn't understand. When I got home, my mother asked how it had been. I told her the pastor said I was special, and she smiled, saying it was a blessing to hear that. But I didn't tell her about the way he said it, or about the touch on my hair, because I thought my mother would laugh at me, saying it was nonsense. At night, I lay in bed thinking about it. I tried to pray for God to show me if everything was okay, but sleep didn't come easily. Today I know that discomfort was a warning, but back then, I was just a girl and had no way of understanding what was happening. The next day at school, I was playing with Cassie during recess. We were running around the park, laughing loudly, and for a moment I forgot about the tightness in my chest. But then, as we were resting on a bench, I told her what the pastor had said, that I was getting pretty and would soon be a young woman. Cassie stopped smiling right away. She frowned and looked at me seriously. She said she thought it was weird for a pastor to say things like that it didn't seem right. She told me I needed to be careful because sometimes adults weren't as good as they seemed. I laughed, saying she was overreacting, that Pastor Miller was a man of God, that everyone trusted him, but Cassie's words stuck in my head. On the way home, I kept thinking about whether she could be right. Was the pastor really being strange? I didn't want to believe it, because my mother said he was a holy man, and my father always said he was an example for the community. But the way he looked at me, the way he said things I didn't quite understand, was starting to bother me. When I got home, my mother was sewing a dress for the church picnic and asked if I was excited. I said yes, but my voice came out quiet, and she didn't notice my head was full of troubled thoughts. That Sunday at church, the pastor preached about obedience, saying that children had to listen to their elders because God spoke through them. I was sitting in the front pews, just as he liked me to, and I felt him looking at me as he spoke. His eyes seemed to find mine every few sentences, as if the sermon was meant for me alone. After the service, he called me to help tidy the altar for the next meeting. I went, but this time I was quieter, with a weight on my chest. He noticed and asked if everything was all right. I said yes, that I was just tired. But today I know he was testing how far my trust in him went. As I arranged the flowers, he remarked how beautiful I looked in the dress my mother had made, calling me a princess of God. The words made my face burn, and a familiar chill returned to my stomach. Colder this time. He moved closer, his hand landing on my shoulder, its weight sudden and heavy. "What we talk about, Willow," he murmured, his voice low, "is a secret. It's between you, me, and God." I nodded my head, not really understanding, but feeling that something was wrong. When I left the church, I ran home with my heart beating fast and didn't even tell my mother what he'd said. At the dinner table that night, my father asked how the service had been. I told him the pastor preached about obedience, and he said I should always listen to what the pastor said because he knew best. My mother agreed, saying I was lucky to have a man of God guiding me. I smiled, but inside, I was confused. Cassie's words wouldn't leave my head, and that touch on my shoulder, that request for a secret, was filling me with a fear I couldn't explain. Today I see that those were the first signs of something very wrong, but at the time, I had no way to understand what was coming. The days passed, and the discomfort I felt with Pastor Miller grew heavier, but I still didn't know what to do with that feeling. Cassie's words telling me to be careful stayed in my head, but I tried to push them away, thinking she was exaggerating. My mother kept sending me to church almost every day, and I went because I didn't want to disobey. I was 11 years old, and at that time, I didn't know that what was happening was going to change my life forever. One afternoon, my mother asked me to take a notebook she had prepared for the pastor to use in his meetings. I went with the notebook in my hand, my legs feeling heavy as if something were pulling me back. When I got to the church, the hall was empty. Only the pastor was there, sitting in the small room at the back. I knocked on the door, and he opened it with that smile that used to make me feel special but now sent a chill down my spine. He took the notebook, thanked me, and told me to come in, that he wanted to show me something about faith. I entered but stayed near the door, my heart beating fast. He told me to sit in a chair and began to say that I was a very obedient girl, that God liked that. He said I had to trust him because he was the guide God had placed in my life. I just nodded, not saying a word, feeling a tightness in my chest. He stood up, came closer, and ran his hand through my hair slowly, as he had done before. But this time, he didn't stop. His hand moved down to my shoulder, and he squeezed it gently, saying I was a blessing, that God had chosen me to be special for him. I didn't know what to say. I just felt my body freeze as if I couldn't move. Today, I know he was manipulating me, using faith as a weapon to trap me. At the time, I didn't understand. He continued speaking in that soft voice, saying that I could never tell anyone what we talked about, that it was a secret between me, him, and God. He said that if I told, God would be sad with me, and I would no longer be blessed. I felt my eyes well up with tears, but I didn't cry because I was afraid to disobey. He knelt down to my level and ran his hand over my face slowly, saying that I was a pure girl, that he would guide me on the right path. My stomach turned, but I couldn't say anything. He told me to stand up and go with him to the altar. I went, my legs trembling, smelling the scent of wax from the candles I had lit myself earlier. He led me to the altar and made me kneel, the scent of candle wax thick in the air. "Close your eyes, Willow, pray with me." I obeyed, but I couldn't find the words. I could only feel his closeness, his presence blotting out everything else. He took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong, and whispered that God was watching. His fingers traced a slow path up my arm, and a tremor ran through my entire body. "You are an angel, chosen to obey," he breathed, his voice a poison in my ear. I wanted to run, to scream, but fear had turned my limbs to stone. His hand slid from my shoulder to my waist, pulling me against him. "This is our sacred secret," he whispered. "God understands. Don't be afraid." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, and silent tears began to trace paths down my cheeks. He held my face with both hands and said that I was his now, that God had given me to him. I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew it was wrong, that it wasn't of God. When he finally let me go, I was shaking all over. He straightened his clothes, smiled as if nothing had happened, and told me not to tell anyone, that God punishes those who disobey. I got up from the floor with weak legs and ran home without looking back. When I arrived, my mother was in the kitchen and asked if everything was okay. I lied, saying I was tired, and ran to my room. I threw myself on the bed, my body feeling heavy, and cried softly, afraid she would hear. Today, I know that my childhood ended that day, there at that altar, with no one to save me. That night, I couldn't eat anything. My father asked if I was sick, and my mother said I must be tired from helping at the church. I just nodded my head without a word and asked to go to bed early. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, feeling an emptiness I had never felt before. I tried to pray, asking God to help me, but it felt like he wasn't listening. The smell of wax and the pastor's touch wouldn't leave my mind, and I didn't know what to do with that weight. Today, I see that was the beginning of a suffering that would follow me for years. The next day, I didn't want to go anywhere near the church. I went to school, but was so quiet that Cassie noticed right away. She asked what was wrong, but I couldn't tell her. I just said I had a headache, and she hugged me, saying that if I needed to talk, she was there. I wanted to tell her, but the fear of disobeying the pastor, of God punishing me, was greater. I spent the whole day with that lump in my throat, feeling like something inside me had been torn out. And the worst part was, I knew I would have to go back to the church because my mother wouldn't let me stop helping. After that day at the altar, the girl I had been was gone. His touch, his whispered words, the cloying smell of candle wax, they became a part of me, a phantom weight I couldn't set down. At 11 years old, a door to my childhood slammed shut, and I was left on the other side, alone. The silence I was forced into became my prison, its walls built from fear and shame. In the days that followed, I began to avoid the church as if it were a cursed place. Headaches, homework, exhaustion. I armed myself with a growing list of excuses each time my mother told me to go. She would frown, her patience thinning. "Stop being lazy, Willow. Your work for the Lord is important." I would nod, a lump forming in my throat, my hands trembling. His threat echoed in my mind. A sacred secret, a punishing God. The fear was so absolute, so powerful, that it silenced the truth before it could even form on my lips. At school, I was different. Cassie noticed I didn't laugh like I used to. We would play in the park, but I would be quiet, staring at the ground, my head full of dark thoughts. One day, she pulled me aside and asked what was going on. I said I was just tired, but she didn't believe me. She looked me in the eyes and said I seemed sad, that if someone had hurt me, she would help. I wanted to tell her, I swear I did, but the fear of disobeying the pastor, of God punishing me, tied my tongue. I just shook my head and asked her not to worry, but I felt a lump in my throat that wouldn't go away. At home, my mother started to get suspicious. She would ask why I didn't want to go to church anymore, saying that Pastor Miller had asked about me, that he was worried. She said I couldn't abandon my duty to God, that helping at the church was a blessing. My father would listen and agree, saying I had to go back, that the pastor was a good man who was guiding me. I would listen to it all in silence, my hands sweating, feeling like I was going to explode. I wanted to scream that the pastor wasn't good, that he had hurt me, but his words echoed in my head, "Don't tell anyone, or God will punish you." So, I swallowed my tears and promised to go back. One morning, my mother caught me by surprise. She said the pastor was going to stop by our house to talk to me, that he was concerned about my absence. My stomach churned, and I almost dropped my plate of biscuits. I tried to invent another excuse, but she spoke firmly, saying I was going to stay home and listen to what he had to say. When he arrived, all smiles with his Bible in his hand, I wanted to disappear. My mother welcomed him with coffee, overjoyed, and made me sit next to him. He looked at me and asked why I had been staying away, in that calm tone I used to find so kind. He said God missed me at the church. I lowered my head. He leaned in and whispered, so my mother couldn't hear, that I had to come back, that our secret was important to God. He quickly ran his hand over my knee under the table and smiled as if nothing had happened. My body froze, and I felt a chill run up my spine. My mother asked if I was okay because I was pale, and I said I was just a little cold. He laughed and said I was sensitive, that God liked that. When he left, my mother said I was lucky to have such a caring pastor guiding me. After that, there was no way out. My mother took me back to church the following Sunday. I was shaking, but she held my hand and said I would feel better there. When I walked in, Pastor Miller saw me and gave me that smile that now made me sick. He came to greet me, called me his little helper in front of everyone, and my mother smiled proudly. I went to arrange the flowers, but my hands were trembling so much I almost dropped the vase. He came closer and said softly that I had done the right thing by coming back, that God was happy with me. He put his hand on my shoulder, squeezing it, and I felt the urge to scream. At night I lay in bed and cried quietly, afraid my mother would hear. The weight of that secret was suffocating me, but I didn't know who to tell. I tried to pray, asking God to get me out of that situation, but it felt like he was very far away. The pastor's touch, his words, the fear of being punished was all stuck to me like a shadow. Today I know that silence was a prison, but at the time, I thought it was my duty to keep it. My mother kept praising me for going back. My father said I was being strong, and I would fake a smile while inside I was breaking. At school, Cassie insisted on knowing what was wrong. One day, she saw me crying near the park and hugged me, saying I could trust her. I wanted to open my mouth and tell her everything, but fear held me back. I just said I was having problems at home, and she promised to help me if I needed it. But I knew I wouldn't tell, because the pastor had made me believe it was my fault, that God would punish me. And so the weight of silence grew, squeezing me tighter each day, as I returned to church with a heart full of fear, not knowing how to escape. Being forced back to the church was a unique kind of torture. The girl who once belted out hymns with joy was now a hollow shell, her voice trapped in her throat. I could no longer lose myself in games of tag with Cassie. The laughter felt foreign, belonging to someone else. The pastor's secret was a slow-acting poison, leaching the color and joy from my world. At 11 years old, I was burdened with a knowledge that stole my right to be a child, leaving an old, weary soul in its place. The pastor didn't stop. Every time I went to church, he would find a way to call me over to help with something, taking me to the back room or to a corner by the altar. He would say I was special, that God was happy with me for keeping our secret. But every time he got close, I would tremble, my body freezing up. He would run his hand over my shoulder, through my hair, sometimes down my arm, and speak softly, saying I was a blessing, that God loved me for obeying. I couldn't move, couldn't say no, because the fear of God punishing me was greater than anything. Today I know he used my faith to trap me, turning something pure into something twisted and dark. The abuse continued with calculated precision. He would find moments when we were alone, during weekday visits to prepare for services, when I stayed late to clean up after prayer meetings, when other volunteers had left early. Each time he reinforced the same message: this was God's will, I was chosen, and silence was sacred. He would touch me inappropriately, always followed by prayers and biblical verses that made me more confused and ashamed. The physical violations were accompanied by psychological manipulation so thorough that I began to question my own reality. My mother kept sending me to church, not knowing what was happening. She would say I was quieter, that I seemed sad, but she thought it was just a phase. She'd say helping at the church would bring me peace, that Pastor Miller was a man of God who was guiding me. I would listen in silence, a lump in my throat, and I would go because I didn't have the courage to disobey. When I got there, the pastor would look at me with that smile that gave me chills. He would preach about obedience, about how God punishes those who don't listen to their elders, and I felt he was talking to me, reminding me of our secret. At night I would lie in bed and couldn't sleep properly. I would stare at the ceiling, feeling an emptiness I couldn't explain. Sometimes I would dream of the pastor, of the smell of candle wax, of his hands on my body, and I would wake up crying, my heart racing. I tried to pray, asking God to save me, but it seemed like he wasn't listening. I felt dirty, as if something inside me had been broken. The nightmares became more frequent, and I began to fear sleep itself, knowing what visions would come when I closed my eyes. At school, it became harder and harder to pretend everything was fine. Cassie noticed I didn't laugh anymore, that I didn't play like I used to. One day, we were at the park, and she saw me sitting and staring into space. She came and sat next to me and asked again what was wrong. She said I looked like a frightened little bird, that it wasn't normal for me to be like this. I felt my eyes fill with tears, but I held them back. I wanted to tell her, but the fear of God, the fear of the pastor, the fear that no one would believe me, paralyzed me. I just said I missed being happy, and she hugged me without saying a word. That hug was the only thing that made me feel a little bit of warmth that day. At home, my mother started to get more worried. She said I was pale, that I wasn't eating right, that I seemed sick. My father would ask if someone had hurt me, but I would deny it, afraid to open my mouth. One night, she caught me crying in my room and asked what was wrong. I said I missed my friends, that I was tired of school, anything to make her stop asking. She hugged me and said I needed to pray more, that God would give me peace. But praying didn't help, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pastor's face, felt his touch, and the fear came rushing back. The worst part was that the abuse escalated over time. The pastor seemed to enjoy seeing me scared, seemed to feed off my fear and helplessness. He would call me to help with simple things, like arranging the hymnals or cleaning the altar, and he would take the opportunity to get closer, to touch me more invasively. Once, while I was alone in the back room, he locked the door and said he wanted to teach me more about obedience. He put his hand on my waist, pulled me close, and whispered that I was his, that God had given me to him. I cried softly, asking him to stop, but he said I couldn't disobey, that God was watching. When he let me go, I ran home, my body feeling as heavy as if I were carrying a sack of rocks. My childhood was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to hold on. I no longer sang the hymns with joy, no longer laughed with Cassie, no longer felt like playing. Everything I did was automatic, as if I were a lifeless doll. My mother kept praising me for helping at the church, saying the pastor was proud of me. But I no longer felt pride. I only felt fear, shame, and an emptiness I couldn't explain. The trauma was taking root deep in my soul, changing me in ways that would take decades to understand. Pastor Miller remained in our town for 2 more years before he was transferred. During those 2 years, I lived in constant fear whenever I had to go to church. The abuse continued whenever he could get me alone, always with the same threats about God's punishment if I told anyone. Each incident left deeper scars, not just on my body but on my spirit. When he finally left, I felt both relief and confusion. Part of me hoped the nightmare was over, but the trauma had already taken root deep in my soul. By the time he left, I was 13, and the girl who loved singing hymns was gone, replaced by a quiet, haunted teenager. The damage was done, but I didn't yet understand the full extent of what had been stolen from me. I thought maybe, with him gone, I could go back to being the girl I was before. But trauma doesn't work that way. It changes you at a cellular level, rewrites your understanding of safety and trust, and follows you wherever you go. My friend Cassie never gave up on me. She saw the shadows in my eyes growing deeper over the years. One afternoon, when I was 15, about 2 years after Pastor Miller had been transferred, she stopped me on the path home. "Willow, whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." Her kindness broke the dam inside me. Through sobs, I told her everything, the touches, the whispers, the sacred secret. She held me, her tears mixing with mine, and told me the truth I desperately needed to hear. "He was a monster, Willow. It was not your fault." Cassie listened to everything with her eyes full of tears and hugged me tightly. She said it wasn't my fault, that he was a monster, that what he did was not of God. She said I needed to tell someone, that I couldn't keep this to myself because it was destroying me. I was shaking all over, but for the first time, I felt a sense of relief, as if a stone had been lifted from my chest. Cassie convinced me to talk to my mother. She said my mom would understand, that she would protect me, that I couldn't keep suffering alone. I was scared because my mother had always trusted the pastor, always said he was a holy man, but I knew Cassie was right. I needed to tell someone who could actually help me. That night, filled with a terrifying, fragile courage, I told my mother. I waited until my father was out and sat with her in the quiet kitchen. My voice trembled as I recounted the horror, the words tumbling out in a rush of pain. When I finished, the silence was deafening. My mother stood, her face a mask of disbelief. "You are making this up," she said, her voice cold. "Pastor Miller is a man of God. How dare you tarnish his name with such lies? God will punish you for this." She sent me to my room, her final words a slap. "I will pray for God to forgive you." Her denial was a second violation, a wound deeper than the first. When I finished, I was crying so hard I could barely see her face. But what she did next hurt me more than I could have imagined. My mother was quiet for a moment, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then she stood up, crossed her arms, and said I was making things up, that Pastor Miller was a man of God, that he would never do something like that. She said I was tarnishing the name of a holy man, that God would punish me for lying. She said I must be confused, that maybe I had imagined things, that children sometimes make up stories to get attention. I went up to my room, threw myself on the bed, and cried until I had no more tears. The betrayal felt complete, first by the pastor, now by my own mother. The one person who should have protected me had instead chosen to protect his reputation. My mother started treating me differently after that, with a look of suspicion, as if I were a stranger. My father knew nothing, and I didn't have the courage to tell him, afraid he would say the same thing. That day scarred me more than I could have imagined. The courage I found to speak turned into a new wound, because my mother's disbelief made me feel even more guilty and alone. After my mother called me a liar, the world shrank and grew silent. I carried her disbelief like a second cross, heavier even than the first. Pastor Miller was long gone, but his ghost remained, etched into the church pews and into my soul. The years after my 16th birthday passed in a gray haze. I finished school with my mind elsewhere and took up small sewing jobs. My hands stayed busy, but my spirit remained numb. My relationship with my mother became distant, filled with unspoken words and careful silences. I felt like a ghost in my own home, in my own town. The years turned me from 16 to 18, and still I remained, trapped not by walls, but by a past I couldn't escape. For months after graduating high school, I couldn't stand looking at the same streets, the same faces, the same memories anymore. Then, shortly after my 18th birthday, I saw a young girl, no older than I had been, laughing with our new pastor. A cold, visceral fear seized me. In that moment, I knew if I didn't leave, I would simply evaporate. Running away wasn't just a choice, it was the only way to reclaim my life. One day, I heard that a seamstress in Knoxville needed help, and that gave me the idea I'd been searching for. On my 18th birthday, I packed a small bag, taking the little money I'd saved from sewing for neighbors. I told my mother I was moving to Knoxville to find work as a seamstress. She accused me of abandoning the family, but she didn't try to stop me. Leaving that town was not an escape, it was an act of survival. I arrived in the new city, with my heart in my throat, not really knowing what I would find. I rented a simple little room with a cement floor and an old bed, but it was my own space. I started working as an apprentice for the seamstress, Mrs. June, a woman in her 50s who didn't ask many questions. She taught me how to cut fabric, how to thread the machine, how to make a perfect hem. I liked sewing because it kept my hands busy and my mind a little quieter. Slowly, I started earning my own money, buying fabric to make my own dresses, and even selling them to the neighbors. But the trauma didn't go away easily. At night, when I lay down on that hard bed, the nightmares returned. I would see Pastor Miller, feel his touches, hear the words that made me believe it was my fault. I would wake up sweating, my heart racing, and I would stare at the ceiling for hours, trying to breathe. I tried to pray again, asking God to forgive me, but it felt like he was still silent. The flashbacks would hit me at random moments, the smell of candle wax in a store, the sound of hymns drifting from a church, even the sight of a man in dark clothing would send me spiraling back to that altar, that room, those moments of helplessness. It was hard, but I started to understand that I needed help to get out of that hole. It was one afternoon, while I was sewing a dress, that Mrs. June found me crying. She asked what was wrong, and for the first time in years, I felt the urge to speak. I told her everything, my voice trembling, as if each word were tearing a piece of me away. I told her about the pastor, what he did, about my mother, who didn't believe me, about the fear that followed me. Mrs. June listened in silence, her eyes filled with tears, and then she hugged me. She said I wasn't alone, that it wasn't my fault, that I was strong for having survived. She told me about a women's group in the city that helped people who had been through things like that, and she encouraged me to go. I went to the group, scared, but there I found people who understood me. They were women of all ages, each with her own story of pain, and they welcomed me as if I were family. I talked about what happened, crying like I never had before, and they listened without judging me. One of them, Miss Eleanor, gave me a simple book about healing, with prayers and stories of survival. Another taught me to take deep breaths when the nightmares came, to try to calm my heart. Little by little, I started to feel a bit lighter, as if those women were helping me lift the weight I carried. The healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong and hopeful, other days the pain would crash over me like a wave. I learned that recovery meant accepting the bad days along with the good ones, and that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to carry the pain without letting it destroy me. There were setbacks, moments when I thought I'd made no progress at all. But the women in the group reminded me that healing takes time, and that every small step forward was a victory. I continued to sew, and the work became my salvation. I made dresses, blouses, even some dish towels that I sold at the farmer's market. The money came in slowly, and I was able to rent a better room, one with a window that looked out at the sky. But the trauma still surfaced. There were times I would see a man who looked like the pastor on the street and I would run home, my heart in my throat. There were nights I would wake up screaming, and Mrs. June, who had become almost a mother to me, would come to calm me down. Today I see that she and that group saved me, because without them, I don't know if I would have made it. Over the years, I was living on my own, with my own little sewing room at home. I never went back to my old town, and my mother and father only came to visit every now and then. They never knew the whole truth, because I never had the courage to tell it again. Cassie would write me letters saying she missed me, and I would write back, but I avoided talking about the past. The women's group continued to be my support, and I started helping others who were going through similar things, sharing my story to give them strength. It wasn't easy, but every day I survived was a victory. I learned to find joy in small things again, the satisfaction of a perfectly sewn seam, the smile of a customer who loved her new dress, the warmth of sunlight through my window on quiet mornings. These moments of peace were precious, hard-won treasures that I collected like a miser saves coins. They couldn't erase what had happened, but they proved that beauty still existed in the world, that I was capable of creating something good from the wreckage of my past. Looking back now, I see that running away was the best thing I ever did. I left the town that hurt me, found people who welcomed me, and learned to stitch together a new life with the hands the pastor tried to soil. But the peace was never complete. I still feel an emptiness when I think about it. I still have nights when the fear returns, but I got up, I fought, and I survived. And that struggle, everyone, is what keeps me telling this story. Today, at 65 years old, I look back and see a life full of scars, but also of struggle and unexpected grace. I am Willow, and after everything I've been through, I've rebuilt what I could of my story. I live in a simple little place, in a small town here in Tennessee, with a sewing room that puts food on my table. I sew dresses for the young women in the neighborhood, I make kitchen towels for the markets, and I even teach a few girls how to thread a needle, just like Mrs. June taught me. The peace I searched for so long never truly arrived, and today I know that some wounds never fully close. Pastor Miller died many years ago. I heard it was from sickness, and I never saw him again after he left our town. I never had the chance to confront him, to ask him why he did what he did, why he used God to hurt me. That is something that squeezes my chest to this day. I wish I could have told him to his face that he was not a man of God, that he stole my childhood and made me carry a guilt that wasn't mine. But he's gone, and I'm left here with the memories that still surface on the darkest nights. My mother and father are gone now, too. My mother died without ever knowing the truth. Because after that day, she called me a liar. I couldn't bring myself to tell her again. She continued to live in her blind faith, thinking the pastor was a saint, and I didn't have the courage to say anything more. My father never knew, and I think it was for the best. Before they passed, we would see each other every now and then, but it was never the same. I felt an emptiness every time I looked at my mother, knowing she didn't believe me when I needed her most. Today I see she was trapped in her own idea of faith, but at the time it hurt more than any physical wound. Cassie, my childhood friend, is still a part of my life. She got married, had children, and lives in a nearby county. We talk through letters or when she comes to visit. She was the one who gave me the strength to speak up for the first time, and I will never forget that. Even now, in her letters, she reminds me of my strength, tells me how proud she is of the woman I became despite everything. Her friendship has been one of the few constants in my life, a thread of gold woven through decades of gray. But even with her friendship, even with the women's group that welcomed me, even with the work that sustains me, the trauma never leaves me in peace. I still have nightmares from time to time. I still feel a chill when I pass by a church and hear hymns that remind me of those days. I try to pray, but my faith has never been the same after what happened. I learned to live with this pain, to sew it into the fabric of my memories like a crooked thread that won't come out. I've helped other women who went through similar things, and that gave me a purpose. In the support group, I tell my story to show that it's possible to survive, that we can get back up even after falling so far. But the truth is, I never truly healed completely. What the pastor did to me changed me forever, and my mother's disbelief scarred me in a way I can't fully explain. I survived, yes, but the peace I wanted, the peace of a child who sang hymns without fear, that I never found again. Today, looking at the threads I sew and the girls I teach, I see that I did the best I could with what I had left. I held my head high, I fought to have my little house, my work, my life. But the emptiness is still here, and I think it will be until the day I close my eyes. Yet there is something to be said for endurance, for the quiet heroism of getting up each morning and choosing to continue. Every stitch I make is an act of defiance against the darkness that tried to consume me. Every young woman I teach is a victory over the silence that once imprisoned me. Every day I breathe is proof that evil did not win, that the little girl who loved to sing hymns still lives somewhere inside me, scarred but not destroyed. My survival is not a story of a battle won, but of a long, quiet endurance. Life is indeed tough, but our capacity to endure, to stitch together a new day from the scraps of yesterday, is tougher still. Even if perfect peace remains elusive, the act of going on is its own victory. And that is my story. I have poured out my heart to you now, shared the heaviest burden I carry, and in doing so, I hope I have lightened it just a little. And now, I want to hear from you. What burden are you carrying silently in your heart? What story does your heart long to tell? I invite you, if you feel ready, to find a voice for your own story. Share it, even if it's just with one trusted friend. Don't let silence be your prison, as it once was for me. If stories like mine touch you, and if you believe in the power of sharing, please consider supporting spaces where survivors can speak their truth. Together, we can create a world where no one has to feel alone in their darkness.
Thank you for listening to this story, my dear ones. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Grandma's Tales. Like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from. I love hearing from each and every one of you. Until we meet again in another story, stay strong, stay kind, and remember, you are never alone.